Sallu ala al-Habib sallallahu ta'ala ala Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa alihi wasallam. Uh, Dear viewers of Leicester Fadani Medina Facebook page, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back again to our Facebook page. And as always, every day end up with some sort of technical issues and problems. But here we are live again with our Dr. Adin. Dr. Adin, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Okay, so I do have some technical hiccups with my laptop. You have sent me some images as well about the topic today, but may not be able to share them. So my apologies to you and the viewers, but I'm sure that you will all join us like you've done previously. And if you have any questions, you can always obviously ask Dr. Adin, and inshallah Zawajal, we will try to address that and answer that as well. Now, one thing, Dr. Adin, whenever you are online with us, Alhamdulillah, we get almost 3 times live viewership. So I'll let that secret remain behind the scenes. So we'll go off with our topic today. The topic that we have today is obviously blood pressure. Uh, that's a very, very important topic. I don't know whether we can call it a silent killer or not. We'll ask Dr. Adin about that as well. Let's go off with the topics is obviously the questions. So blood pressure, Dr. Adin, from your point of view, how much of a problem do you think it is in general and particularly for Asian people?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. So, Jazakallah for inviting me again to discuss this topic. I think we've had a common theme, which is sort of health prevention and promotion of good health throughout the topics that we've chosen. Now, specifically with regards to blood pressure, it's actually more what we're going to talk about is high blood pressure. Now, in the medical term, we just say hypertension, hyper. Most of you know the term as being high, and then tension, just the tension relating to the tension in the blood vessels. So we find that there's a roughly between 1 in 3, depending on where you look, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 adults are affected with high blood pressure. Now, this covers a vast number of people, both men and women. And what we find is, generally speaking, men are more affected than women. But actually, the balance is reversed when they actually get a bit older. If I get time, I'll go on to that a bit later on. Now, one of the things you asked is how much of it does it affect our Asian population? Now, unfortunately, we spoke about this a little bit when we were talking about the diabetes talk, where those of Black, African, Caribbean, and also Asian descent generally have diabetes, or at more risk of getting diabetes. Unfortunately, the Black and African Caribbean are more at risk of also getting higher blood pressure. Now, if we look at the link between diabetes and blood pressure, that also translates that a lot of the Asians who suffer with diabetes will then go on to have high blood pressure. And if we looked at this in terms of those sort of statistics, we find that 6 out of 10 people who have diabetes will actually have high blood pressure. Now, whether this is picked up at the same time, because most people will have this done as part of their health check when they reach 40 plus, part of the NHS, but also, other people who may have symptoms and then go on to get their diabetes treated may find that actually their blood pressure was a little bit elevated. Now, you touched on something very early on, which is the silent killer. Now, that's quite true in some respects. Most people who have high blood pressure actually may not have symptoms. So it's one of those opportunistic things. Someone either has a blood pressure machine in the family and they've checked it and it's high, or they've gone for a check at the GP or a chemist and had a blood pressure check for any reason, just as a routine thing as well, and they've found it to be elevated. So one of the problems that we find is that a lot of people are going around in the population not actually being treated, and they estimate over 50% of the UK population, so that's probably about over 5 million people have high blood pressure, but actually don't know they do. Now, so this is the silent killer, because blood pressure being high can lead on to various complications. Specifically, what we look at is those who have cardiovascular disease, and that's in the sense of heart attacks, strokes, but also one of the biggest things, and I think we touched on this very slightly last time with the diabetes talk, as it was posed as a comment regarding kidney disease, but also blood pressure. is one of the leading causes of kidney disease. We call it nephropathy, and along with diabetes, they're the two most common causes of this problem. But as we've highlighted earlier, because most of the people that have diabetes may also have high blood pressure, unfortunately, these people have a sort of double whammy where they've got two disease processes that can affect their kidneys. Now, if you want to sort of say, well, some people say I do get symptoms, and that's quite true. So having high blood pressure, just like with anything else, it can cause you to have like a headache, and normally like a pounding headache. The pressure is really high; it's there in the the other thing that it can do is also can affect people's vision, so that they can't see very clearly, or their heart rate starts to go irregular, or they actually find some blood in the urine. Now, all of these are actually late complications of blood pressure. So the symptoms that you find because the blood pressure was left untreated, it's very unlikely that someone who just starts off to have high blood pressure will actually have those problems, because those are long-term so what we call pathological problems of high blood pressure. Okay.
Okay, well, luckily I've managed to get one of your images on the screen, and very soon I will share it with the our viewers as well. And let's just wait. What it is, it's basically talking about what is normal blood pressure, what are the stages of blood pressure. So that will be my next question, and I've timed the image quite nicely with that. So talk
Mm,
us through before you go to the symptoms so that our
mm.
viewers understand that this silent killer, what sort of stages it goes through, so that they can be actually quite proactive in terms of, you know, doing something about it.
Okay, so the reason why I chose this one is it's quite easy to sort. We always get familiar with amber, red, and all those things. So green is good. So there's a nice box there, and what that shows you is if you're systolic. Now, what we refer to as systolic is most people have a blood pressure machine and they have a top number and a bottom number. So the systolic is when the heart actually beats and it gives a pressure in that sense, from that pumping, and that's known as the systolic or the top reading. And that's 120. So up to 120 is deemed to be good. Now, obviously, there's a range. So the range is actually anywhere between 90, as in the top number, to 120. Having lower than 90, yeah, I wouldn't say it could be a problem, but actually, some people might actually be suffering with low blood pressure, which is the opposite of what we're going to be discussing today. So that can also be a problem in some people. And then the other part, so that's the as you can see going upwards, I think it's on there, and then going across, you can see that the bottom number, which we call the diastolic, that's when the heart relaxes. There's another pressure there, and that should be 80 or below, and that's usually between 60 to 80. So if you're between 120, 80, and 90 and 60, that's good. Okay. Now, when you start to go beyond that, so anywhere between 120 to 140 in terms of the top reading, means that you're in sort of the early stages of actually going on to develop high blood pressure. Now, depending on where you look, I think the Americans have a different classification, but in the UK, this is ours. What we classify is anything above 140 over 90. So that's the sort of going into the yellow. That is actually when we would class that as being stage one hypertension. So this is the early stages of hypertension. The other bits are like the bits where you're at risk of getting high blood pressure. Now you've got it established. Now the
So
way
just one question here.
yeah.
How can people actually recognize or find out that they are in the pre-hypertension or first stage? Because clearly there won't be many symptoms. So I just want to ask you this question: is there any way should we actually be everyone be checking our blood pressures from what age onwards, so that we identify that we are in pre-hypertension stage?
Okay, so generally what they say is for healthy adults, check your blood pressure at least one every 5 years. But if you've got risk factors, and we'll go on to what those risk factors are later, then ideally you should be checking it every year. Now, there's no harm in checking your blood pressure early as well. Now, what we find is that your blood pressure starts to increase from about the age of 20, in your mid 20s anyway, and gradually it would increase to a degree of about 20 millimoles by the time you're in your 40s. So checking your blood pressure early on, there's no harm, because most people will still be within the sort of normal range, but they shouldn't have any wait for symptoms before you get blood pressure problems is probably going to be too late. You might find that you're actually in the red zone by the time you start to show symptoms, and there can be a lag of several years, 5 to 10 years, even in some people, before they actually go on to get these symptoms. So, if you've got the opportunity to have your blood pressure checked, whether someone actually has a monitor at home or if you go to some chemist, some surgeries may also have one in the reception area. Just you check your blood pressure and see what it is, because blood pressure is one of those things that goes up and down. So one day it might be high, but actually you check it again at a later time in the day and it's actually lower. And that's when we sort of get people also, from when we're measuring them, we don't just rely on one reading. We think, well, actually it's high today, but it could be because they're anxious, there's something else going on, they've rushed to get here. So we get them to do readings at home because they're more relaxed in the home environment, and then we get the average of what their blood pressure has been like throughout usually 7 days, and then we work that out, and then we get a figure. Now the figure, obviously we're still relying on a specific measurement, but the measurements in the average is slightly in between those readings. It's not exactly clear cut as that. So just get it checked if you're concerned, but don't wait for symptoms. Hello, Ziruk? Hello?
Can you hear me now? I think I
Yeah, yeah.
accidentally muted my mic. Now we've got,
Okay.
mashallah, our brother Altaf Hussain. He seems very educated. Either he's a patient of these diseases or he's a healthcare worker or a doctor. So he says that high blood pressure can give retention, which in turn can damage kidneys. This is what happened with me. First of all, may Allah Azza
Yeah.
wa Jal give you shifa. So if you could just shed some light regarding that comment.
Yeah. So normally it's not the high blood pressure resulting in retention. It's the retention causing the high blood pressure. So it's usually in reverse. And unfortunately, once that sequence starts, it perpetuates itself. So, as we mentioned, that kidney disease can be a feature of high blood pressure. It can also be the cause of the high blood pressure as well. So, people will have kidney disease for various reasons, whether it's diabetic, some people are born with it in their genetics, and they unfortunately inherit a condition where the kidneys fail very early. Now, when your kidneys aren't filtering the urine out, so you're not able to produce enough urine, or you're not producing the right amounts of urine, or the quality of the urine is altered, then what essentially happens is you start to leak proteins. Okay, and that can cause water to escape from the body. Now, one of the things that can actually cause is water to then seep out from the blood vessels, because there's no pressure in keeping it in the blood vessels anymore, and it can leak away into the other spaces, and that's how people start to retain fluid when they get to sort of late stage towards their kidney failure. So, and unfortunately, as the more fluid they retain, the higher the blood pressure becomes, because the volume in the system is actually getting larger anyway, and the body has to sort of maintain that by increasing the size of the blood vessels, which unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, leads to more problems, where actually you lose more protein again from the kidneys, which then feeds that cycle of problems.
Let me just I've got another image there, which is the risk factors, and I think we want to obviously discuss a fair amount of spend some time discussing these risk factors. So things that can cause blood pressure and what can we do about it. If you could obviously go through these images that we have on the screen for us, please.
Okay, so the first one is to do with the gender, so obviously being male or female. Now, what we found is that by the age up to about 65, men generally have the higher blood pressure in comparison to the women, but actually when they go over 65, it's women that have the slightly higher blood pressure than men. They're sort of still both in the equal territories, but we see a reversal in the balance. The other thing that we talked about is before, and we mentioned it, I think when we talked about the diabetes side, is being overweight. Or obese. Now, one of the comments that feeds into the last question, which is about retention of fluid causing high blood pressure and obviously the kidney damage, is obesity. So this is the fat that we have actually causes fluid retention. Okay, now this happens for various reasons. One is actually a direct consequence where it releases the fat cells themselves release something called leptin. Leptin is a hormone, and essentially what it does is it actually increases someone's blood pressure. But fat in itself also is a problem where actually it causes retention of fluid in itself. So the two together can actually cause problems with your blood pressure. The other things that we go on to, I'll spoke about the ones that you can't really change first. I think when we go on to the prevention, we might actually cover the others anyway. So the other thing that we talked about is the genetics. Now, there are some people that unfortunately have a condition that leads them on to develop kidney disease, but also can lead them on to get blood pressure problems regardless of their kidney disease. And they've found in twin studies the variation in your blood pressure is about 40% variation is found between twins that are identical. So they have the same genetic component, and they know that 40% of those changes in the blood pressure actually just relate to the genes rather than their lifestyle. And one of the other problems which you talked about very early on with regards to the Asian population is the Black and African Caribbean people. They are unfortunately more likely to have kidney problems and also can go on to have high blood pressure. But also because these people are at risk of getting diabetes, and we know that diabetes is linked to hypertension, then they have the sort of double jeopardy where they actually both suffer from two different disease processes. Now, the other risk factors is basically, I think you can't, yours is cut off on that one, but the physical activity. We spoke about it quite a lot in the diabetes talk in terms of trying to exercise and reduce your weight. But reducing your weight will obviously improve the lack of obesity, and as a result, less leptin, which means that actually there'll be less retention of fluid, hence your blood pressure improves. But also what they found is that actually by doing some sort of exercise, the millimoles that they look at in terms of your blood pressure actually goes down. So doing even 10 minutes of exercise, 3 times a day, doing about 150 hours in a week, spread it out over 5 days, half an hour a day. What that's proven is that the blood pressure will improve, but also it has the other health benefits, which is regarding the diabetic side and obviously the obesity side. We won't touch on the alcohol, but I know it's there. But it's something that unfortunately does result in having high blood pressure, but also causes damage to other organ structures, primarily the heart, when the heart can actually get dilated and doesn't pump effectively, which again can cause problems with your blood pressure. And then the other one shall I just go through? I might as well just go through them while we're at it. Because it'll
Yeah.
probably just rather than coming back to it. So the other thing is to do with smoking. Now, one of the things that we find is that smoking is quite bad for a lot of conditions. Also, it can put you at risk of having strokes quite significantly. So one of the things that we know is that if you are a smoker and you're not a smoker, so your risk, this is independent of everything else. If a person is a smoker, he's twice as more likely to have a stroke than a person who doesn't smoke. Now, if you're smoking over 20 cigarettes a day, then you're 6 times more likely to have a stroke. So it's quite significant. That's a pack of cigarettes, the big packs usually a day, because cigarettes contain a huge number of chemicals in tobacco, even including carbon monoxide, which is actually a poison, arsenic and cyanide, and all of these things you probably hear about, poisoning in some sort of chemical warfare and things. But actually, these are also present in smaller quantities within tobacco. So when you are inhaling them, they're affecting the way your body can actually utilize oxygen or the cells to carry the oxygen that you need. And smoke, what it does is actually causes the blood to thicken up a little bit. Now, that can be as a result of not getting enough oxygen. So your blood gets thicker because of hypoxia, which is lack of oxygen. We call that polycythemia. Now, the more thicker your blood gets, the more likely it is that you're going to have flow that's a bit sluggish. And if you go through narrow areas where you've got like cholesterol sitting inside, then you're more likely to get a blockage or restriction in flow enough that you'll get a stroke or a heart attack. And also nicotine that's present in smoke causes your blood vessels to tense up a little, quite significantly. So actually the flow would have been fine, but actually as a result of the nicotine, the blood vessels are tensing even more, and it's increasing the blood pressure because the flow is being reduced through those areas. Now, the thing that I'm not sure is in there, which is quite important, well, actually it's on that one, it's on your one, is to do with stress. So what we know is stress can release quite a few hormones which are normal. So like if someone jumped up behind you and you got scared, you release certain hormones to actually get you prepared to run. And that's a physiological response. We sort of say that's an innate response that your body was prepared with. but actually that can happen even when you're under mental stress or very anxious. Unfortunately, the two hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, which are released at those times, can actually not only increase your heart rate but also go on to increase your blood pressure. And what we find is that people who are stressed may actually have other unhealthy habits as well. For example, they smoke, which, as we mentioned, was also a problem that goes on there. Um, I, the most important one, which I think I'm missed off, but it's because it's something that we always come up, is actually about salt. I spoke about it previously, but you want to aim for at least as a maximum of 6 grams of salt in a day. Now that's a teaspoon. Ideally, cut out salt altogether because it's the sodium that's the problem here. And actually, in salt there's sodium, so all you're doing is feeding the problem that your body is trying to get rid of. Okay, so ideally, um, you know, cut out salt altogether, or go on to low salt if you need to have a little bit, or even use alternatives in fruit and vegetables. And aiming for 5 portions of fruit and veg a day is probably better in terms of trying to get that variety in terms of taste that you want in your food products.
Okay, well, that's a very comprehensive summary of risk factors. Didn't want to disturb you too much. Um, so I hope, obviously, with the help of the image, then clearly viewers have understood. But most importantly, exercise levels, smoking, salt intake, uh, and obviously controlling your weight are some things that we can do something about. Yes, we may not be able to do much about our genetic makeup and our gender, but certainly in terms of our exercise levels, our weight, our diet, and especially focusing on the salt, and stopping smoking is something that is definitely, obviously, within our control. We had one question asked from, it's actually from says Fazan Medina, but there's an Islamic brother behind that question. It says, how heartbeat or pulse is related with blood pressure, and heartbeat under 50 and high blood pressure over 150 means what? They're not angry, but they're just asking that it's that's the emotion being carried through the words.
Okay, so basically, your blood pressure is a combination of your cardiac output, which is how much your heart beats out within a minute. So the volume of blood that's floated around your body within a minute, and also the resistance that's in the circulation. Now, the resistance is what we call the systemic vascular resistance. Now, that can go up and down depending on whether you've got narrowing or stiffness of your blood vessels, whether you've got an infection that causes the blood vessels to dilate a bit more. Now, in his case, so having a low heart rate, generally speaking, having a lower heart rate, if you're athletic, so if you're a good build and you're exercising, your heart beats better and pumps better. So it actually doesn't need to pump as much. So your heart rate can go down. Okay. Now, one of the things you have to realize is that in those situations, so in that, if we look at the athletics, so what we expect as being the low heart rate, we also find that the blood pressure is better because they're just so much better at getting this blood flowing around. There's no resistance, there's no disease in the blood vessels, and there's nothing causing that restriction of flow. So actually, everything's very good, which is low heart rate and also a low blood pressure. Now, if you go on to this brother's comment, which is to have a high blood pressure and a low heart rate, now that can be as a result of various problems, because one of the things that can happen is that your heart can start to struggle to pump around the fluid, and as a result, if the blood pressure is too high and the heart is weaker, it may not be as effective as pumping the blood around. Blood pressure will still be high because the resistance that it is working against is higher, but the heart is struggling. So to get a low heart rate in those scenarios can be a little bit of bad news. Actually, it could be that the heart's not is decompensating in some respects. So it wouldn't be normal to find low heart rate and high blood pressure. There are some situations where people they do have certain conditions where their heart rate is naturally on a lower scheme, and as they get older, the blood pressure will go up anyway. But that's not the common type that we see.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. I hope that Asif Matloob, who was behind that question, he's able to understand your answer. But it's basically heart is all about a pump, and a network of pipes within our body, a bit like central heating system. But I'm not going to go into that detail. It's too much oversimplification. Now, let's move on to the next question. Our brother Altaf Hussain mentioned about kidney problems, and clearly uh, blood pressure is linked to kidney problems. You sent me a picture. To me, it looks like if I look at it as I think it's a child's drawing. But do enlighten us. So, what does this
Okay.
picture mean, and what has got this to do with the kidneys?
Okay. So essentially, what we're seeing here is actually the sort of the behind the scenes of the kidney. So this is what is happening within the kidney at the cellular level. So at the microscopic level, this is essentially what we see. So blood is flowing in. So that's the afferent. So on the left hand side, I think you're putting the cursor there. So this is how when blood comes into the kidneys, and then it reaches something called the glomerula, which is the middle. Now, the whole objective of your kidney is to filter fluid, filter toxins, filter chemicals, sugar, etc. And actually, what it does is it needs to create a pressure like a sieve. So when you want to take something, dirt out of water, or whatever, or even your tea, we've got something inside. You put it through a sieve. The holes will let the fluid pass through, but the bigger things are kept behind. Okay, and the same thing happens within the kidney. So what will happen is that the efferent, which is on the right side, if you can go over to the right side, so the efferent arteriole, which is the blood leaving the kidney, will tighten up to try and create a pressure. So if things have to go from left to right and they get stuck, they will then force themselves through the lower part, which is where the filtering the sieve is, and then all of that will go down the tubule. So these are all the things that then get excreted out. Either some of them will get reabsorbed later on, or actually they don't get absorbed and they get passed out in your urine. Now, what we find is that the kidney needs to do this in order to remain active. Now, if for whatever reason the filtering ability of the kidney is affected, now that can be affected. Now, you can see it can be affected in two ways. That's quite obvious from the picture. One is that the blood flowing through the kidney at the efferent side is reduced, or the blood flowing out is increased, so that the pressure gradient is reduced as a result of that. Now, if I think it's going to get a bit more complicated, but there are certain medications, and one of the common ones is anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen. And what ibuprofen does is actually causes the initial part, the afferent part, to tighten. So it restricts the flow. So actually taking ibuprofen can reduce the flow to your kidneys, which is why it can be linked to having kidney failure, because what your body then does is actually, oh, there's not enough filtering happening. It tightens the second part, but as a result, it actually causes increase in your blood pressure, and increasing blood pressure can also be damaging in other ways. So it's counterproductive. Your body's trying to fight against something that it's not seen before, and as a result, it can actually make it worse. So in the short term, they're okay, but people who take these long term can actually have long term consequence of the kidney trying to remodel. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is when we see in CKD, and Brother Altaf, obviously mentioned this with about retention and things, is what I mentioned about kidney, the protein leaving the kidneys. So the sieve, which is the filtration, only has small gaps. Now the small gaps will trap big particles. Like if the protein is this big and these are the small gaps, it's stuck. It can't go anywhere. But when the kidney actually gets damaged, those areas within the sieve open up even more. So these proteins can actually leak through, and as a result, they're not reabsorbed. You essentially go to the toilet and you pass them out in your water. Normally causes frothy or foamy urine because it's just part of protein, similar to what happens when you get eggs and scramble it. It's albumin that's been leaked out. So unfortunately, that can have a negative consequence. And part of that picture was basically to show that the middle part is where the filtering happens. And if that part is also damaged, then you can, as a result of that, would be your blood pressure will go up, and you'll also start to leak fluid or retain fluid in some other areas.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for that information. We've run out of time. Now, today, there were not as many questions as in the previous two sessions. And I think those viewers who might have been testing you, they were satisfied that you are quite knowledgeable. Okay. So, anyway, that brings us to the end of our blood pressure. Certainly, there are a lot more things that we could have talked about in terms of blood pressure causing obviously strokes, causing dementia, playing roles in obviously all these other cardiac hypertrophy, and so on and so forth. But we had to stick to the basic ones. Certainly, there will be many viewers who may watch our session afterward, recorded ones in the previous sessions. My basic advice will be that this is just as a basic education information point of view. None of our advice is particularly for any individual patient. They must consult their doctor. They should not obviously reduce their medication or anything based just on our advice. They should go and see the GP, speak with their doctor on individual basis, and only follow their own doctor's advice. I hope that all this information that we have shared with you, and especially with Dr. Arden, has been helpful. And uh, just in the last sort of like a minute or two, what I would like to say is that many of you have heard this verse in the Holy Quran. ثُمَّ لَتُسْأَلُنَّ يَوْمَئِذٍ عَنِ النَّعِيمِ, that indeed on the day of judgment you will be questioned about the bounties of Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, which bounties, Allah Azza wa Jal is referring to? Now, in the tafsir of this ayat mubarakah, Hazrat Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he's said that the bounty is actually our good health. Okay, so we will be questioned on the day of judgment about this bounty of good health, physical health, mental health that Allah Azza wa Jal endowed us with, and then how much look after, how much care did we take of it. So certainly having education and knowledge plays an instrumental role in terms of clearly looking after our health. Do engage with your general practice. Do look after, look at NHS website and find out as much information as you can from these reliable sources. Don't just follow the Google blindfoldedly. Always doctors, healthcare professionals, they are very keen to actually educate. You ask them a question, inshallah they'll give you the relevant information. And also keep watching our Fazan Medina page. Today marks the end of Dr. Adin as well for this Health is Wealth session. And today it also marks the end of our Health and Wealth segment program for the month of Ramadan. Okay, I'm sure people will be focusing much more in the last 10 days on the spirituality. Many of Islamic sisters may be sitting itikaf at home. Some Islam brothers, where possible, have set itikaf in the masjid, and I need to concentrate on my spirituality as well. So Dr. Adan, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the viewers for joining our Health is Wealth segment every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. After the month of Ramadan, inshallah, we may come back with Dr. Adin, Dr. Other doctors that we have had on our show, inshallah. Any last messages, Dr. Adin, from yourself?
And just to say that, a lot of the information sometimes can be a little bit complicated. I think, unfortunately, today you didn't do the translation in Urdu for the benefit of the others, so I might get messages to go through all of this now on my phone. But just to say that, there are people that will have specialist circumstances. Who have conditions that unfortunately may not have been covered in the talks that we've done. And the primary aim of the talks was essentially to give the basics and to try and raise awareness. And I think unfortunately some people may find that we're not discussing certain aspects of the condition, and that's not because we don't know about it or we're deliberately avoiding it. It's basically to try and reduce the complication, because we've only got a short space of time to try and include a lot of things, and some things are more dear to certain viewers than others. But I think hopefully the majority will benefit from the vast majority of things that we've just spoke about during these talks.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Adin. Take good care of yourself,
You
and
too.
inshallah, all the viewers take good care. May all the blessings of Ramadan. And finally, there is obviously lots of messages going around. We are still in lockdown, and we will remain in lockdown, unfortunately, on the day of Eid as well. So please, please, please stay in your own homes. Our life is much more important than taking any of these risks, both from medical point of view, from and from public education, public safety point of view, and also from religious point of view. So please stay in your own homes, follow the government guidance, and keep washing your hands. Sallu ala al-Habib sallallahu ta'ala ala Muhammad sallallahu